Greetings Jeepers, this video will go over how to install a rear brake drum on the rear axle on 1947 CJ2A Willys Jeep. All parts mentioned in this video will be from CJ2A Use Jeep 10 at discount to get 10% off. Place the jack stand on the side the rear hub will be installed, and on the other side ensure the tires on the ground. Make sure the shifter is in gear, put it into gear. With the shifter now in gear, the drive shaft is now locked between your transmission, and now that means your rear axle is locked, and now we can tighten this nut.
Next step is to clean your brake drum, so get yourself some brake cleaner.
Apply the high temperature wheel bearing grease to the first lip on the rear hub. The purpose of the grease on the hub is to ride on the rear axle outer oil seal, which is deeper into your axle. Push our hub onto our rear axle shaft, lining up that slot. You push it in just so it's snug. Install the axle shaft key. Make sure that tapered end is facing downwards towards the axle shaft and pointed inwards towards the hub. Install it as so into that slot. If you install the tapered end in the wrong direction, the hub will split. Now use a hammer to tap in the axle shaft key. Use a punch to tap the axle shaft key in further. Tap the axle shaft key until it's flush with your hub. A good tip would be to mark where that hole is in your axle shaft so we know where to put our cotter pin. The next step is to install the rear axle shaft washer. Push it on as so, and then follows with the axle shaft nut. Thread the axle shaft nut on. The next step is to torque the axle shaft nut. Install your 1 7/16 inch socket onto that nut. This will be torqued to 150 foot-pounds. Torqued. After torquing the nut to 150 foot-pounds, you can see that our marks where a hole for our cotter pin will be don't line up with the slots on the crown nut. So we'll have to tighten our crown nut more. Don't go less than 150 foot-pounds at a minimum. Always go more. Reinstall torque wrench and torque the rear axle shaft nut more than 150 foot-pounds to get that cotter pin hole to line up. Tightening the axle shaft nut more has allowed the marks to now line up with the crown in the nut, meaning the cotter pin will slide right through the hole in the rear axle shaft, right through the crown nut, and we'll push it all the way until it seats at the bottom. The next step is now bend the cotter pin. We'll get a flathead screwdriver just to separate the two ends of the cotter pin. We'll bend the first end all the way up until it's against the axle shaft. Now this side of the cotter pin will have to be bent towards the hub. This end will have to be cut to 1/4 inch. Use some snips and cut it to approximately 1/4 inch. Use a hammer to bend the other side of the cotter pin. The final step is to install the wheel hub dust cover. Place it on as so, then we'll get a rubber hammer and we'll just tap it on. The rear brake drum and hub are now fully installed. The final step will be to install your tire. The rear tire is now installed. Watch this video up here to learn how to remove our front axle wheel hub so we inspect those front brakes on our front axle. Make sure to use Jeep 10 at checkout at CJ2A Willys to get 10% off.